Welcome to this deep dive. You've sent us a really interesting collection of articles and notes all about innovation in education. Um, it seems like you're wrestling with some pretty big
Yeah,
questions.
yeah.
We're talking about, how do we even define innovation in education, especially when the world's changing so fast? And how can we make sure that education keeps up with the times but doesn't lose sight of what actually matters?
Exactly. And it's especially important, I think, to think about how those big ideas play out in, well, different contexts around the world,
Hmm.
because your sources point out this really interesting thing. The goals and outcomes for education, they're becoming more and more narrow, and that can end up pushing aside children and ways of teaching that don't fit the mold.
Right,
You know
right.
what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. One of the sources that you sent us was a report from the World Economic Forum, and they talk about how we should be kind of connecting innovation indicators to social and educational objectives. Things like learning outcomes, equity, and whether the public is actually happy with the education system. But then they also dive into this idea of strong languages in innovation, like all the buzz around 21st century skills.
Yeah, that's a really important point. What's fascinating is how this strong language, terms like, disruptive innovation or even 21st century skills, they can sometimes overshadow what's truly important in education.
Right.
It's like we get so caught up in the hype that we forget to ask ourselves, what are we actually trying to achieve here?
Right. It reminds me of one of the authors you sent us, Gert Biesta, and he argues that this focus on strong language and measurable outcomes, it can make us forget he calls it the weakness of education.
Right.
And not weakness in a bad way, but the fact that it's not a simple input-output equation.
Yeah.
You can't just pour in information and expect, a perfectly predictable outcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Education is about shaping people, and that's always going to be complex and unpredictable.
And it's interesting how Biesta points out that education's weakness, its unpredictability, is actually kind of a strength
Yeah.
because it reminds us that we're dealing with human beings, not robots.
Right.
Right. And that's where the real magic happens. He's pushing us to think about, what kind of society do we want, and how can education help us get there? Should schools just be, churning out workers for the current job market, or should they be helping to shape a better future?
That makes me think about another source you shared, a piece by Robin Alexander, who emphasizes how deeply education is kind of rooted in culture. And he argues that you can't understand any educational policy or what goes on in a classroom without considering, the specific cultural context. It's not a one size fits all situation.
Absolutely. And that raises an important question. How do we balance, the need for innovation with the importance of respecting different cultural contexts?
Right.
It's a tricky balance. The UNESCO Innovative Pedagogical Approaches project that you included, it offers some insights here. They highlight what they call catalytic innovations. And these might not fit traditional ideas of best practice, but they can lead to really positive social change.
So we're not just talking about like the newest tech gadget or the flashiest teaching method.
Exactly. These innovations are often, grassroots efforts coming from the community itself. They're responding to specific local needs and challenges. For example, you shared an article about a school in rural India that uses storytelling and local crafts to teach literacy. And that's a catalytic innovation. It might not be high tech, but it's deeply relevant to the community, and it sparks incredible learning. And because they're so deeply rooted in their context, these innovations might go unnoticed or even be rejected at first.
So we've got this tension between, global trends like the push for 21st century skills and the reality that education always happens in a specific cultural context. And then there's this idea that innovation doesn't always have to be disruptive or easily scalable. It can be about small scale, localized efforts that may not fit neatly into predefined categories. It's not just about the shiny new thing. It's about what actually works for the people involved.
That's right. And it's important to remember that Piesta's point about the weakness of education isn't a criticism.
Right.
It's recognizing that education is about shaping people, not just producing widgets.
Right.
Right? And that human element, it means that we can't always predict the outcomes, even with, even with the best intentions and the most innovative approaches. So maybe it's less about trying to control everything and more about creating the right conditions for growth.
That's a really important point. We can't treat education like a factory where we just, input information and expect a perfectly standardized output. But then how do we measure success if we're not just looking at, standardized test scores or graduation rates? How do we know if we're actually making a difference?
That's where things get even more. One of your sources, it talks about combining evidence-based practice with practice-based evidence. It's like acknowledging that we need to be open to learning from what's actually happening in classrooms and communities,
Right.
not just relying on top-down metrics.
So instead of just applying research findings to practice,
Right.
it's about using those real life experiences to inform and refine our understanding of what works.
Exactly.
It's a two-way street.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Teachers are constantly experimenting and finding what works in their classrooms.
Right.
Practice-based evidence means, valuing that experience and using it to inform research and policy.
Right.
And that's where the idea of localized challenges comes in. The sources you've gathered, they encourage us to think about the specific issues facing our own communities.
Yeah.
Do those challenges align with the global push for 21st century skills?
Yeah.
Or are there other pressing concerns that are being overlooked?
Yeah, I mean, I see the value in 21st century skills, but I wonder if overemphasizing them could neglect other important areas like creativity or emotional intelligence.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really thought-provoking question. It's like we get so caught up in the race to keep up with the global economy,
Right.
that we forget to ask, well, what kind of world are we actually preparing students for?
Mm-hmm.
Are we just creating a workforce for the status quo, or are we empowering them to be critical thinkers, problem solvers, agents of change?
That makes me think about what Biesta said about focusing on democracy, care, and equality instead of just survival in the global economy.
Right.
Those are values that might not be as easily measurable, but they're essential for creating a just and sustainable society.
You're absolutely right, and that's where the frailty or weakness of education comes in. We can't program students to be perfect citizens or guarantee specific outcomes, but we can create learning environments that foster critical thinking, empathy, a sense of responsibility for ourselves and others. It's about creating spaces where students can grapple with complex issues, explore different perspectives, and develop their own sense of agency.
So it's about more than just equipping students with the skills to compete in the global market. It's about cultivating the values and dispositions that will allow them to contribute to a better future. But that requires us to move beyond simplistic notions of innovation as disruptive or easily replicable. As the UNESCO project highlights, sometimes the most meaningful innovations are the ones that are deeply embedded in local context and respond to the unique needs of a community.
Precisely. Like the example from Australia we discussed earlier, climate change, an aging population, the need for care. These are all interconnected challenges that require innovative approaches that are tailored to that specific context. Those challenges might not be as flashy or as easily marketable as 21st century skills, but they're no less important for the future of education and society as a whole.
And it's not just about coming up with new solutions. It's also about recognizing and valuing the innovations that are already happening in diverse communities around the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Often these innovations are going unnoticed or even being rejected because they don't fit the dominant narratives about what good education looks like.
But pedagogy is not a mere matter of teaching technique. It's about understanding the values, the histories, the lived experiences that shape how and why we teach.
Yeah.
And that means recognizing that what works in one context might not be transferable to another. We need to be humble and open to learning from different approaches, even if they challenge our assumptions about what's best practice.
If you've got it,
Yeah.
we need to be asking ourselves, what are the purposes of education in our own context? What kind of society do we want to create? And how can innovation help us get there?
Those are big questions, and it's important to remember that there are no easy answers, but your sources suggest a few key takeaways for us to consider.
Yes, let's recap those key takeaways.
First, we need to be critical of the strong language surrounding innovation,
Yeah.
and not let it distract us from the core purpose of education. It's easy to get, swept up in buzzwords, but we need to stay focused on what really matters.
Second, we need to recognize that education is a complex process, not just a technology for producing predictable outcomes. It's not a factory, it's a garden.
And finally, we need to value and support diverse approaches to education that are responsive to local contexts and needs. There's no one size fits all solution. What works in one place might not work in another.
Those are excellent points to keep in mind as we continue to explore this topic.
But before we wrap up, there's one more idea I want to touch on.
Yeah.
One of your sources mentions combining evidence-based practice with practice-based evidence. What does that actually mean in practice?
That's a great question. It's about recognizing that knowledge isn't just a one-way street from research to practice.
Right.
We can also learn from the experiences of educators and communities who are working on the ground.
Right.
It's about valuing the wisdom of the people who are actually doing the work.
So it's not about rejecting research, but about recognizing that it's only one piece of the puzzle. We also need to pay attention to what's actually happening in classrooms and communities and use those insights to inform our understanding of what works and why. It's about being open to learning from multiple sources and acknowledging that there isn't always one right answer.
Exactly. And that's a great foundation for fostering meaningful innovation in education.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the challenges of defining innovation in a rapidly changing world, the importance of considering diverse cultural contexts, and the need to balance global trends with local realities. We've also explored the idea that innovation isn't always about disruptive change or easily scalable solutions. It can also be about small-scale, localized efforts that respond to the unique needs of a community. And we've emphasized the importance of being critical of the strong languages that can shape our thinking about education and lead us to focus on narrow, easily measurable outcomes.
Instead, we've encouraged you to consider the values and dispositions that are essential for creating a just and sustainable society, such as democracy, care, and equality. We've also highlighted the value of combining evidence-based practice with practice-based evidence to create a more holistic and responsive approach to educational innovation.
You've done a great job summarizing the key takeaways from our deep dive. Now it's time for us to turn the conversation over to you, our listener. What are your thoughts on all of this? What stands out to you from all of this? Where do you see opportunities for meaningful innovation in your own context? And how can you make sure those innovations are truly equitable and benefit all learners?
You know, it's important to remember that meaningful innovation doesn't have to be something totally new or groundbreaking. Sometimes it's about adapting something that already exists.
Right.
Building on local knowledge and finding creative ways to address the specific challenges and opportunities in your own community.
It could even mean like question the way things have always been done, being willing to experiment and learning from what doesn't work as much as what does.
Absolutely. And above all, keep your focus on what truly matters, creating learning environments where all students can thrive and grow.
We've explored so many fascinating ideas in this deep dive, from the power of strong language to shape our thinking to the importance of valuing diverse approaches to education. But ultimately, it's about what you take away from this conversation and how you choose to make a difference.
The world of education is constantly evolving,
Yeah.
and it needs passionate individuals like you to question, explore, and create positive change.
So keep asking those tough questions, keep experimenting, and keep advocating for what you believe in. We'll be right here with you on the next deep dive.